Good afternoon or good morning, everyone. It's nice to be here. Thank you for Glen Oaks for hosting us. And I'm finally, and first time in my career, I've always wanted to do this. I wanted to be the guy that followed Jeff McFadden, so I can check that off the box. So, anyway, just a quick introduction before we introduce Ray. Little background on myself. I just realized this weekend that I've been in this business for 40 years now, going back to 1981, and I was talking to my wife about that, and she's an author, so she has a very interesting way with words. And I talked about that 40 years, and she says, Ken, do you have 40 years of experience, or do you have 1 year experience 40 times? So I thought about that, and I said, you know what, I know what I want the answer to be, but I think it's probably a combination of both. Which is I'm going to connect the knots here in a little bit, just before we get into the meat of that, because in that, I've dedicated my career to the private club business, except I did take a 15-year vacation as a restaurateur. And then when we sold that thing in 2007, it was my plan to take 2 years off to recover from my vacation. And by about 13 months into that, I decided I was going to go back to the club industry for some peace and quiet. So at any rate, club benchmarking was established in 2009, and it happened to be the time that I went right back into the club business. And it was really fortunate for me that at the same time that I was getting back into it, I ran into Ray, met Ray, and understood what he was trying to do. And getting back to the 1 year experience over and over again, that's kind of where the club business was. We were doing things year over year as opposed to looking forward and looking ahead. At least that was my experience in it, working with not only my management teams, but also with the boards that I was dealing with. And in 2009, we were right in the middle of that recession, and there were more questions than answers, but there were also a lot of opinions. And so what we like to say in club benchmarking is that through the years that Ray and his partners and his team has been doing the research on the club business, looking at data, looking at financial data primarily, and discovering concepts that we hadn't been talking about in our industry, at least when I was in it before, and it really opened a lot of doors, and it opened my eyes to a lot of things. And so I became an early promoter of club benchmarking and learned a lot, and was able to then take some of the opinions that were flowing throughout the club, in the grill room, not just the boardroom. I mean, everywhere in the club where opinions were flowing all the time, and if the strongest, most charismatic voice in the room was usually either win the argument, or people would just say, okay, you got it, let's move on. But through the years, the data has shown that our industry is a fragmented cottage industry, and where best practice has, disseminated very slowly, if at all. And with the advent of what we've learned in club benchmarking and focusing on fact-based or process-based governance, has been a game changer for very many, for all the clubs I've been involved with, and many others, and the hundreds of clubs that Ray's been involved with over the years. And so with that, what we've learned is that the clubs that are most successful are the clubs that have a constantly changing, constantly evolving vision, with a very strategic board at its helm. And then beyond that, just a broad support from the members to that vision to continue to grow the club. And so this is our systems model for, we like to say, where you have your members are owners versus customers. Okay, I think most of you probably understand what I'm talking about there. But financial and financial position and sustainability is built on the member engine ultimately. And that's not having the right number of members, paying the amount of money that's necessary to fund the experience and to grow the club. Okay, now that doesn't sit out there in its own orbit by itself. It's supported by several other pillars, the operating ledger of the club and the capital ledger of the club. Now, the operating ledger of the club that we found is, set to break even for the most part. Ray's going to get more into this in detail. And that's where the membership experience is delivered. Members consume that. The capital ledger, is where all the investment happens, reinitiation fees, capital dues, and what have you. And of course, the staff engagement is all part of this too. And of course, that can be found on the operating side. But that structure supports that membership engine through satisfaction and through fresh facilities, adding new amenities, et cetera, and feeds up into the financial sustainability. And that doesn't sit out by itself either. That's supported by a governance system that is more strategic than operational. And then that then supports the culture of ownership versus customership. Where members actually have a say as an owner as opposed to just being customers consuming products. So what we've learned over the years, if you look at our industry, about 75% of our industry are clubs. And this is true anywhere in the country. It's true in challenged areas as opposed to, as well as economically developed areas as well. But about 75% of the industry is either staying flat or is declining or is leveraged. 25% of our industry is in the red bucket. Those are the clubs that lean towards cost cutting and efficiency. About 50% of our clubs are in the yellow bucket, which are kind of staying flat. They could go with certain decisions, they could go into the green side or the red side. And then there's 25% that are growing purposefully. And that's an important point because it's the choices that clubs have made over time that have gotten where they are, whether it's been very successful or not so successful. And the recession was a very key moment in our industry, and that's where clubs took a decision track of either leaning towards the member experience or competing on price. And so, how do you compete? Do you compete on value or are you competing on price? So, piggybacking a little bit on what Jeff said about change and the necessity of change. This is a demographic chart of the generations going back over time. And data has shown that over the last 30 years or so, and maybe even beyond that, it's very consistent that new members of the club are joining at the average age of 42. It's been the same for a long time, and that hasn't changed. But what has changed, and you can see that maybe one of the reasons why we had a headwind in our business going back is because there was a declining number of 42 years old in the last 15 to 20 years. Now, the new crop of 42-year-olds were born around 1979 or 1980, and they're just now coming into what we would call clubbable age. And there's going to be a growing number of those going out to about 2030, 31, 32. Now the question is, and these are the millennials, folks, do they have the same interests as we did as baby boomers when we were 42? In other words, if you're building your granddaughter's club, what is she interested in going forward? And what are you doing as club leaders to provide the facilities and the experience and the direction that's going to attract that new 42-year-old? And so what you see here is the echo of the baby boom growing up, and it's likely for clubs with broad amenities are going to see a tailwind in the coming years. So mission clarity is very, very important. And so there's two main points that we talk about at club benchmarking that are the most important things that we can think of looking at the data, and what the data tells us about success and what have you. And the first point is to have a member experience that is so compelling that the members want to be at the club, they want to join the club, they want to introduce their friends and associates to the club. And you charge them the necessary amount of money so that they can access that and have fun. All right? And of course, the second part of that is to always have enough capital Now we break capital down into two areas: obligatory and aspirational. Okay, so to have enough capital for the obligatory, which is the things around you that are at the club, the things you don't see, HVAC, irrigation, having enough capital to maintain those assets at a high level. And then have enough aspirational capital along the way so that you can add new assets and new experiences to the mix. And the question is, and that's all based on your ever-evolving vision, which is getting out of the stuck routines of efficiency or whatever, and moving forward with a forward-looking capital plan where you are looking at your club's competitive value or your value proposition. And then the question would be, are you taking that vision and you're fitting your budget to the vision, or are you fitting your vision to the budget? And so those are questions that I think most boards should be asking themselves, with the idea that you're going to provide a compelling experience that's going to be sustainable for the future, with enough money coming in to take care of your debt, your obligatory capital, and adding new assets as we go along. So there's two prevailing perspectives here. We talked a little bit about efficiency view, and then making the place a great place view. All right. So would all of you join your clubs at some time if you're members of a club, and you're very happy to sign that big check and start enjoying the club. But did you ever ask at that time? He said, excuse me, I'm getting ready to go out and play golf, but I want to know, is this club run efficiently? I doubt very much that any of you asked that question. But for some reason, when people go to committee or they get into the board, somehow that gets into the conversation somehow in the governance side. And so we would like to see, through the data tells us, is that the clubs that are most successful in the board, they're not talking about efficiency. They understand it's a high fixed cost environment, and that the money that you put into the operating side is consumed by the members having fun. And the value proposition side of it, make this a great place for you. Let's make the club great. What's next? What are we going to do next? And so before I hand it over to Ray for the rest of the presentation, we like to say that we like to see clubs transform from a 90% operating governance to, we'll see, it's 10% in strategic, but try to keep things in a strategic way. Rather than focusing on food costs and the things of the operation and looking backwards on that month. Always looking forward, always looking at a strategic view of how to make the club better and better, have that compelling member experience moving forward to move your club forward with success, and especially with the next generations coming along. So it's my pleasure to introduce to you Ray Cronin, and he'll take it from here. Thank you very much for the time, folks.
And happy to be here. So this all just builds exactly on what Jeff said. Jeff's club, Jeff's vision, supported by his board, his committees, as he said, frankly, is transforming the industry. Because the data, it's funny, Jeff got to it from a strategic business standpoint as an expert and having been involved in clubs for a long time. We came at it from a different angle. We came at it from looking at financial outcomes, and have deduced based on those financial outcomes that what happened, or what is happening at the Union League of Philadelphia, a member-centric experience that's constantly changing and evolving, as Ken said, is the root of success for clubs. And we've discovered metrics that literally quantify how well a club has done or is doing at that mission. There's 5 things we learned. I'm not going to read all these. You have the slides on your memory stick, but these are the 5 kind of business model and financial model concepts that we've deduced by studying data. Can address one. Clubs are a high fixed cost business. Expenses aren't bad, they're good. We want the expenses to be higher, not lower, because they represent the member experience, period. Jeff's grown his club dramatically, as we heard. His expenses are 7 times higher, 8 times higher than when he took the club over. That's not a bad thing, that's a good thing. He's also got a whole bunch more members to amortize those expenses over, which is the whole point. I'm gonna dive right into a couple of things. This is just data that kind of shows that the clubs that have the highest operating expenses are the clubs that are the healthiest. So the clubs with the highest operating expenses on the left, which is the upper quartile, the median initiation fee is $70,000. The clubs with the lowest expenses, the clubs with the highest are on the right, and the clubs with the lowest are on the left. The median initiation fee in the clubs with the lowest expenses is $7,000. They also have less than a third number, close to a third less members than the clubs with the higher expenses. The thing that happened during the pandemic, which is obviously the title of this presentation, and it's exactly what Jeff referenced at the outset of his presentation. He referenced unrelated business income. Most of the clubs in this room are not-for-profit member-owned clubs, and you have to track how much of your revenue is derived from non-member activity. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, Jeff, you said your UBI went from like 20% when you took the club over to less than 4% now, 2% now. So he's grown the club explosively, but not by doing outside banquets or outside golf tournaments or trying to fund, which is effectively what that's about. It's trying to fund the operation of the club from non-member activity, and that's the way clubs end up in the red or yellow bucket. It doesn't work. And the beauty of the pandemic is that we learned that because we couldn't have those activities. So what we've seen, the most important metric on the operating ledger of a club, from our view, is what we call the dues to revenue ratio, okay? So it's what percent of the operating revenue comes from membership dues revenue. The median for the industry, clubs with golf, to be clear, is 50%. But if you look at what happened during the pandemic, so there's clubs that in the lower quartile, that's the red bucket clubs, they have what we call as a leveraged operating model. They're trying to fund the member experience more from non-dues revenue than from dues revenue. And you can see that a quarter of the clubs are in that bucket. During the pandemic, there was only about 15% of clubs. Now, these are clubs that weren't relying on non-dues revenue from non-members. They're relying on non-dues revenue from members. Does that make sense? And the biggest issue here is food and beverage. The biggest issue in the industry is the food, what we call the food and beverage trap, where we sit in the boardroom, the finance committee room, or the house committee room, and wonder why we're losing what we lose in F&B or why we can't make more money in F&B. And the data can't be more clear. The healthiest clubs in the industry, the ones that have the most capital, that have the highest initiation fees, are the clubs with the greatest deficit in F&B. And about 20% of the clubs in the industry have a surplus from F&B operations. Those are the red bucket clubs. They're the clubs with the lowest initiation fees. They're the clubs that need the most members. And they're the clubs that do not have the capital necessary to reinvest in the club. The pandemic, it shows it very clearly. I mean, the graphs I get may be tough to see, but the chart on the upper left corner of the screen is the dues to revenue ratio. You can see how consistent it was until the pandemic occurred and it went up. And then on the lower right is the food and beverage revenue as a percentage of the overall club revenue. And you can see that decline during the pandemic. This is 2020. But it didn't decline because members weren't eating at the club. It declined because the banquet revenue went away, which is primarily a non-member activity. But clubs actually did better than during the pandemic financially than they did prior to the pandemic. Now, truth be told, part of that related to the employee retention tax credit, no question, okay? But clubs do a very good job and have done a very good job for years and years and years of managing the operating ledger. What clubs do very poorly is managing the capital ledger. Clubs go out of business, and they do. 7 clubs that I know of went out of business last year. member-owned not-for-profit clubs. I analyzed the finances of all 7 of them. All 7 of them broke even operationally, as most clubs do. All 7 of them were massively behind in terms of capital maintenance. They had such deferred capital needs that when they get in the room and they look around the table, they're like, we need $25 million to reinvest in this place. And they look at each other and realize we ain't coming up with the money on our own. So they close the doors and capitulate. It's capital that gets clubs in trouble, not the operating ledger. This just shows what's going on. The curve on the right, we track this monthly for about 300 clubs, shows the change in dues revenue prior to the same month in the previous year. So you can see the dues revenue was actually above what it was in 2019. The chart on the left is non-dues revenue. Most clubs, the non-dues revenue was a bit lower through the pandemic, and again, that was because of the change in the banquet revenue. But this shows the operating margin. So 90% of the clubs in the industry set the income statement to break even, excluding depreciation. All right? So depreciation is considered a capital expense. This data just confirms that. What you see through the years, we've been collecting data since 2010, is that the operating result, excluding depreciation, is right at break even. It hovers right around break even. And it hovers around break even because clubs intentionally set it to break even. But the key point, this is the most important thing we've learned studying this data. The key point is break even is not a financial outcome by definition. The operating ledger, even with all the banquet revenue, even with all the golf outing revenue, is a break-even outcome. It doesn't produce a financial driver for the club. All that revenue does, the banquet revenue or the golf outing revenue, all it does is defray the amount a member has to pay in dues, and it only defrays it marginally. Does that make sense? But it isn't a financial driver. This is, so many clubs get themselves in trouble. Like, we got a lot of board members here. I'm going to ask a question. When you're doing the budgets, or when you're looking at the finances of the club and you're on the board, just yell it out. Do you spend most of your time on the income statement or the balance sheet? People are trying, because they know. I mean, I got the idea for this business, it wasn't in the introduction. When I became a member of the board of my club, I'm a numbers guy. I have an engineering degree and an MBA. I was in high tech. And in the high tech boardroom, we don't sit around and wing it. When we make decisions, we have data. I was on the Greens Committee before I became a member of the board. I got the idea for the business when 5 of us on the Greens Committee with the superintendent in the room were discussing the upcoming budget for the next season, for the course. And 2 of the guys, very successful business people, if I'm being polite, I'd say they got into a discussion. If I'm telling the truth, I'd say they got into an argument. And one of them thinks we spend too much maintaining the golf course. The other one thinks we spend too little. And I watched the tennis match for 20 minutes. And I said, may I ask a question, please? One of the guys kind of gruff. What? He's mad because I want to ask a question. I said, how would you know? Like, how would we know whether we're spending too much or too little? I don't know. He goes, well, I got a buddy on the board of Walpole. It's a very similar club 7 miles away as the crow flies. I said, that's great. What's Walpole spending? He goes, I don't know how much, I just know it's more. and that literally is when I had the epiphany for this business. That story, anyone that's been involved in the club, that resonates because it happens in every board and finance committee meeting every month. We're just winging it. I get a little off track there, sorry. I'd like to address a metric that ties what Ken was saying in with what Jeff presented. And frankly, it goes right back to all the other presentations, starting with Joe. It's a metric we discovered. It took us 7 years to discover it, and I'll never forget how it came to be. But I did a presentation one night at a club in Florida. There was 350 members in the room. And we were in a beautiful banquet facility that had been updated 6 years earlier by the club using $6.5 million of debt. The club took $6.5 million of debt and renovated the banquet facility. And the business case espoused when they did it was, if we do this, we'll make so much money in F&B we'll never have to raise dues again. How do you think that worked out? So when I showed the data to the members that they weren't actually even making money in F&B, one of the members that was present shot out of his seat and screamed at the top of his lungs at me. I'm not exaggerating. And it prompted me to start thinking. I kind of knew what I had just said, which is the operating ledger is a break-even financial outcome. And then I started thinking about the equity portion of the balance sheet. Every business, organization, every club, right, has an equity portion of the balance sheet. We refer to it as net worth because everyone understands the concept of net worth. And if you just put a little bit more color on it, we all know that net worth should increase over time. Fair enough? But based on what we learned a minute ago, the only way you can increase the net worth in a club is if there's enough capital income to overcome the depreciation expense that's not put on the income statement. Does that make sense? Okay, how much capital income does a banquet facility generate in a club? Zero. So I started thinking about it after this guy shot out of the seat. Normally when I do these presentations there at night, there's a few people in the room that know me fairly well and they know I'm from Boston. My name's Cronin, so I finish the presentations usually at 9 and I find the closest pub to have a couple of beers and a burger before I go to the hotel. That night I was so excited about this thought, I didn't even go to the pub, so it's a really powerful thought. I went back to the hotel and I had 3 clubs in my mind. I wanted to look at their net worth over time. The club I just left in Florida, my hypothesis was that once they put that banquet facility in, $6.5 million, what happens to the depreciation expense? Takes a jump. How much capital income do they bring in from it? Zero. So I'm thinking their net worth declining since they invested in a banquet facility. I was thinking about my own club. I belong to a club 20 miles south of Boston. I'm very proud of the club. I'm not one of them, but it's one of the best golf clubs in the country, and that's not an exaggeration. We had 2 national champs in the last 3 years. And then I was thinking about a club like Jeff's that's in Charlotte, North Carolina, that's invested heavily in the member experience over the last 20 years. And my hypothesis was their net worth was going to go up. My club was flat, I was figuring, and the club in Florida was going down. It exactly worked out that way. So since then, we've charted, and we have more clubs. Any not-for-profit member-owned club, we have your data in our database now. And the reason we can do that is because you know that if you're a not-for-profit, that your tax return is a public document. And we've linked up to the IRS database so we can pull the data. But this curve right here shows the compounded annual growth rate of the equity portion of the balance sheet for about 1,000 clubs since 2006, okay? We don't have enough time, it's okay. We don't have to get into the details. If you want afterwards at the lunch, come up and we can do it. We'll talk about it. But obviously the net worth has to go up at least the rate of inflation or we're getting behind, right? We use construction as the measure of inflation, not the core CPI. And so it turns out that the net worth should really be increasing for a club, the equity. The equity portion of the balance sheet should be increasing at least 3.5% a year. Only a third of the clubs, of that 1,000 clubs, are meeting that threshold. The club industry, this was Jeff's point, if it isn't focused on purposeful growth, I think Jeff used words something like this, we're either growing or dying. That's the bottom line. If we're not changing the member experience, if we're not investing in the future, if we're not growing the club, then we're going backwards. And unfortunately, up to the pandemic, effectively 2/3 of the clubs in the industry are going backwards. And here's the kicker on it. Because we already learned this. What causes that decline is the lack of adequate capital to reinvest. I did a little research. I did a board retreat for Jeff's club last year. His compounded annual growth rate at Union League of Philadelphia since 2006 is almost 10% a year. That puts them way out here, okay? And it's because they invested in the member experience. The members' equity, I'm using a little loosely. The members' equity at ULOP in 2006 was $22 million. They closed their fiscal year in June. So on June 30th, 2020, it was $77 million. It's somewhere between tripling and quadrupling. But when we look at this, 2/3 of the clubs in the industry are effectively flat or negative. They're going the wrong way. And it's everything to do with what Danny Meyer said, what Ken said, what Jeff said, in terms of how we manage the club. Are we managing it to the member experience? Or are we sitting in the board and finance committee room saying, we shouldn't be increasing expenses, actually we should be cutting expenses? Have you ever heard that in your club? Why would we cut the expenses when they represent the member experience? Is that gonna help the club move forward? No, it's gonna help the club move backwards. At the Union League of Philadelphia, and this is an important point, why do we care about equity? You might ask that question, it would be a reasonable question to ask. If you look at the average club's balance sheet, we know what members' equity represents now based on what we just learned. If the income statement is break-even proposition excluding depreciation, then what members' equity in a club is the sum total of all of the capital income in the club's history minus the sum total of all the depreciation that's occurred in the club's history. We deal with clubs where that number is negative. A fair number of clubs, and I've looked at many of the clubs in this area, they're hovering around $2 or $3 million. But if you look to the other side of the balance sheet, the asset side, the whole story comes together. It's so symmetrical and logical, it's crazy. 80% of what a club owns is the net book value of property, plant, and equipment. It's the asset value after depreciation. So if a club has an 18-hole country club, let's say, has $1 million of equity on the balance sheet, how the heck do you think it looks? Because the assets are worth $1 million. That's the irrigation system, all the golf course maintenance equipment, the golf course maintenance facility, the clubhouse, the parking lot, the pool. It's worth almost nothing because the club hasn't reinvested in the asset base. So we care about members' equity because members' equity represents two things ultimately. It represents how well a club has grown and evolved in concert with the society's changes, the ULOP being an example, but it also represents how well we've done, to Ken's point, as owners, coughing up the capital out of our own wallet to reinvest in the club. If we think like customers, and someone stands up in the member meeting and says, hey, have you ever heard this? Everyone here is involved in governance. And sometimes this is funny stuff because the problems are so common across clubs. Have you ever asked your members for another $100, $200 a month in capital dues? And had the people, I think Jeff used the term skeptics, have the skeptics say, what are you asking me for money for? Why do I have to cough up more money? I've been a member here for 40 years. You ever heard that one? I'll just tell you a quick story of how this works. At a golf-only club, my club, golf only, I became president in 2015. I was on the board for 7 years prior to being president. The irrigation system we had at the club at the time, tremendous golf course, was installed in 1964. We had geysers coming out of the fairway once or twice a summer because the main lines were rotted. I actually had one happen when I was on the fourth hole. It happened. If you ever seen a geyser go, it's pretty scary. Or a main line go. But I had a member meeting in June of 2015 to kick off the process of raising the capital, put the irrigation system in that's obviously way too old. So I start the presentation. 5 minutes into it, one of the older members jumps out of the seat and says, Ray, can we cut the crap here? I'm 75. I joined the club 50 years ago when I was 25. I'm moving to Florida in 3 years. Why the heck should I have to pay for this irrigation system? First I said, thank you, God. I can't believe he asked the question because I was ready. And then I thought to myself, thank God he asked it. I was really happy. His name's Phil. I said, hey, Phil, we only had recurring capital dues at the club for 10 years. I said, forget the last 10 years that we've had recurring capital dues. Let's talk about your first 40 as a member. Okay? He goes, sure. He said, what's the initiation fee you paid 50 years ago? So that was 1965. What's the initiation fee you paid in 65 when you joined? He said, I get it proudly. I get in a 2-week-long executive special. I paid $50. I said, that's beautiful. So for your first 40 years, your entire capital contribution was $50. That's $1.25 a year. I said, I'm not trying to get you to pay for the irrigation system we're putting in. I'm trying to get you to pay for the one you've been using for the last 50 years. It's a true story, and it's true in every club in the industry. The older members tend to not want to contribute to capital, but the reality of the situation is they've under-invested their own money into the club. And that's why clubs have these outcomes. That top left corner is a club in the Midwest. If you go back to about 2000, it was right square in the middle of the Golf Digest Top 100 golf courses, private golf courses. The club's on its way to bankruptcy. The club on the right was the club I had mentioned earlier, that's like Jeff's club, that's focused on the member experience for the last 20 years. And you can see their net worth is going up. And then the average club is that yellow bucket. The point simply is this: there's data that exists now. Those metrics didn't exist until 6 years ago. We discovered it. But that metric will tell you instantly. By the way, it won't tell it for all clubs, and there's a little bit of a, I don't know if Dan Cronin's still around, but there's something in the water on Long Island that makes clubs want to avoid using GAAP to do accounting, because you get a fair number of clubs that don't depreciate assets, which that's a whole nother story. But if a club follows GAAP in terms of asset capitalization and depreciation, this one metric, the net worth over time, will instantly tell you how well you've done in terms of keeping your club in shape and how well your members think. Do they think more like customers or owners? Which of these two charts do you think the clubs think like owners versus customers? And it manifests on the balance sheet very easily. So the club that has the negative net worth is too afraid to ask the members for capital, so they go to a bank and they end up with a debt to equity ratio of 450%. And by the way, when they invested that money, if they invested in the wrong things and it doesn't drive new membership into the club, it's just going to accelerate the demise and accelerate the negative trend in net worth over time. And then the clubs that invest properly end up with a very robust balance sheet. It's strong, and there's one more metric I'll show you, and then I'm done. It's on every, if a club follows standard depreciation policies or average depreciation policies, there's another metric we discovered, which is the net to gross property, plant, and equipment ratio. It's just a measure of how far through the depreciated life the assets of the club are. The median for the industry is 46%. So that club that has the negative net worth, you see their red circle? They have a net to gross PP&E ratio of 39, meaning their assets are more depreciated than the norm. The club that has the increasing members' equity, even though it's an old club, the club was founded in 1908, has a net to gross PP&E ratio of 65% because they constantly invest in their asset base. And what happens is, if clubs don't plan properly for capital, which I'll contend is 75% of the clubs in the industry at minimum, you get into a situation like this. This is a club in the Northeast. Everyone in this room knows this club's name. It's not far from here. It's not in New York. It's in Pennsylvania. In 2004, on the left, they had a net to gross PP&E ratio of 29%. And they knew that they had to reinvest in the club. So they redid the clubhouse, and they did it with debt. It took them 2 years, so when they finished the project, you see where their net to gross PP&E ratio went. But they didn't properly plan to both pay the debt back and keep on reinvesting in their obligatory capital. So they paid the debt off. I was there last September. They literally wrote the last check on the debt last year. But their net to gross slipped all the way back to where they were. They're going through these generational cycles of update, then 20-year decline. Update, 20-year decline. They've been doing this for 100 years. They're not the only one. There's a lot of clubs stuck in that negative cycle, if you will. So with that, I'll say this. The pandemic, this is the data we collect monthly. What that shows on the left, on the right is August of 21. 55% of the clubs in the industry have increased their initiation fee since August of 20. The prior year, only about 20% of clubs had. So the pandemic has given a boost to the industry for sure. But the key issue is, are we going to continue on the path the pandemic put us on, which is a member-centric model with member-centric financing, with the ability to get our members to think like owners so that we continuously reinvest the proper amount of capital over time? Those are the critical questions that emerge from the pandemic. With that, I'm finished, because I know we got lunch and golf at this beautiful club, but if there's any questions, I'll take a couple. No questions. Okay, everyone's ready? Yes, sir.
Between debt, especially if the debt interest rates are low and you can utilize that leverage, not crazy leverage, and equity from the members. Is there some type of...
It's a great question. So the question is about the balance between debt and equity. I'll tell you, the question we get asked most often is about profit or loss in F&B. The second most often asked question is, what's the right amount of debt? Or how much debt is too much? There's a magazine that the National Clubs Association produces twice a year. We put an insert in. There's an insert right in that one from us. But the previous one, we did a whole insert on debt. And I'll answer the question this way. The average club has a debt-to-equity ratio, and by debt here I mean third-party debt, not member bonds. It's just third-party debt. Lease debt, mortgage debt, lines of credit. Has a debt-to-equity ratio of 20%. There's clubs that have a debt-to-equity ratio of 10%, and there's clubs with debt-to-equity ratios of 70%, and the ones with 70% could be healthier than the one with the 10%. The primary issue is this: do we generate enough capital income to pay off the debt and meet our obligatory ongoing capital needs and aspirational capital needs, and potentially increase our cash reserves over time to an acceptable level, and we don't have to worry about that. So the club with the 10% debt to equity ratio may only be able to pay the debt back and not penetrate the other layers of that hierarchy. And the one with 70% may have done a capital plan that allows them to meet all those needs. So that's the real issue. Can we not only pay the debt back, but meet all the capital needs that are going on, and they don't stop, as you know. Does that make sense? So the question, it does, there's a cycle, if the dues go up too high, but the whole point of the forward-looking capital plan is to get that balance right, not overnight, but over a 5 to 10 year period, do it gradually. But without that plan, we'll never get there. That's the issue. Yes, sir.
In clubs you seem healthy, what's the ratio between obligatory debt and aspiration?
Yeah, look, that's a great question. Obligatory capital and aspirational. The average club, I wanted to say this, so just to use ULP as an example. ULP has $150 million of gross assets, and after depreciation they're worth $90 million. The average club has $24 million of gross assets. After depreciation, the net is $11 million. Just to get a sense of that, over a 10-year period, if you look at the average club that is trying to grow, not a stagnant club, a club that's trying to evolve and keep up with the times, you'd probably end up seeing about 65% of the capital is obligatory and 35% aspiration. 2/3, 1/3. The problem is that too many clubs don't even meet the obligatory needs and don't do any aspirational investment. That's when we get a shift. Jeff?
Is your data showing that people are blending their capital dues and their operating dues together, which is what we're doing, to create so that governance can decide on what's aspirational, what's obligatory, and what we're going to put into savings? So instead of having two separate dues lines that were an assessment line with regular dues, blending it into one annual number or one monthly. Are you seeing that?
There's a trend both ways. I can say this. We've tracked the data. When we started the company, about half of the clubs in the industry had recurring capital dues, separate line item. Now it's about 80%. It's changed pretty dramatically. Whether it's one line item or two, I have an opinion, I'll reserve the opinion. It's really a religious discussion, frankly. The key is, do we have enough money to do what you know you have to do and what other clubs have to do, which is meet the capital investments. Okay? Well, thank you. And by the way, I tell you this, we do, if you want, we do a net worth and balance sheet benchmark for free for the industry, for any club. So if you want one done for your club, just find us and shoot us an email and we'll do it. And thank you. Thank you, guys.